Born in the 1960s Iowa, this accomplished individual is not only an author and illustrator of children's books, but also a passionate advocate advocating for diversity in literature. As a child, our guest embarked on a quest for a multicultural world, discovering it by reading encyclopedias when the children's book of his era depicted a world that seemed predominantly white. His dedication to fostering inclusivity and representation in children's literature led him to co-found the Brown Bookshelf, working tirelessly to ensure a wider range of perspectives and voices are heard in children's literature. With a career spanning numerous accolades and awards, he has captivated readers with his inspiring stories of historical figures who persevered even during the challenging era of American slavery. His book, It Just Happened, When Bill Traylor Started to Draw, a captivating biography of folk artist Bill Traylor, a former slave. This book garnered numerous awards, including a Lee and Low New Voices Honor Award and an Ezra Jack Keats New Writer Honor. In his work, he often writes about historical figures who persisted during the period of American slavery. He also spoke of his work with stories of enslaved people and preserving these narratives, stating the importance of telling children the truth and not sugarcoating history. Without further delay, let us extend a warm welcome to our guest of honor, the multi-talented Don Tate.
Christopher, thank you for reaching out to me.
Can you share with us more about your childhood experience of reading encyclopedias to find multicultural representation in the absence of diverse children's books?
Yeah, so the encyclopedias were called and I found them on the internet this morning, the Funk and Wagnall's Young Student Illustrated Encyclopedias. And I remember they were like bright day glow orange. I'm never going to forget those images. But the thing that really stood out to me about those encyclopedias were on the cover, there was an African woman in what appears to be like a beaded native headdress, very colorful. And there's also an image of a Native American sculpture. And what that cover communicated to me, to the 8-year-old Don Tate in Des Moines, Iowa, is that I wasn't alone in this world. The few African Americans that lived in Des Moines, we weren't by ourselves. There's an entire world made up of people of color. And in fact, if you look at the demographics of the world, people of color make up the majority of the world population. And so for the first time through those encyclopedias, I felt seen and I felt recognized and I felt welcomed when I opened up a book. And so I think that because I read encyclopedias as a kid, it's probably what put me on a path to telling nonfiction stories, particularly nonfiction stories that feature diversity as an adult.
While you are now a prolific author and illustrator of children's books, did you always aspire to be a writer, or did that passion develop later in life?
I didn't start writing until about 2009, which is a very short time in my writing career. As a kid, I was a shy kid, so I expressed myself through drawing. I just kept my hands busy, creating and drawing and painting. And the last thing that I wanted to do was express myself with words. I was never good with words. The words would all come tumbling out in all the wrong order, in all the wrong grammar. And then when I got into publishing, I felt like, it's my job as a visual storyteller to tell stories with pictures. And I stayed far away from writing. But once I moved to Austin and I joined an organization called the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, my writer friends encouraged me to try to express myself through words. And it was my friend, writer Cynthia Laddick-Smith, who said, "Don, you can write." And so I gave it a try. And what I discovered is that everyone has the ability to tell a story, and that I need not be ashamed of the fact that I don't speak in perfect Queen's English. My broken English and the way that I speak speaks to my history, my family history, and it is the personality that I leave on the page as a writer. So I write every day and I put my broken words onto the page, and that's the personality that I leave for my readers.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your role and experiences as one of the co-founders of the Brown Bookshelf?
Yeah, so the Brown Bookshelf was started by YA authors Varian Johnson and Paula Chase Hyman. This would have been around 2005, 6, 7, somewhere around in there, and they both had new books that were going to soon publish. And their concern was that that their books would publish and that they would go under the radar of the publishing industry, that their books wouldn't get the same marketing dollars that others, get. And so they decided to start the online initiative, the Brown Bookshelf, to advocate for other African American children's book writers and illustrators. And at that time, I loved to blog. I loved to social network. And so I would talk about my work. I would talk about my day in and day out of being an author and an illustrator. And I was also championing other Black creatives and calling for more diversity. I'm an online extrovert and an in-person introvert, but they heard my voice out there. And so they invited me to join the Brown Bookshelf. Our flagship initiative was called 28 Days Later, where we would highlight a Black creative writing or illustrating for children's books during the month of February. And we would do that every day of the month through an interview, asking authors about their writing journey, what their future, what they wanted to do in the future, and just helping to get the word out about their books.
How has this initiative contributed to promoting diversity in children's literature?
Well, the children's publishing industry, I would say over the past 7 or 8 years, has changed quite a bit. I remember a time when I first got into publishing, I would go to the bookstore and there were lots of books on talking animals, and there were lots of books on fairy tales or bugs or trucks or whatever, but there weren't very many books that featured characters of color. And I even remember some stories that were about characters of color that featured white characters on the cover, because the publishing industry would say that, well, Black characters simply aren't going to sell books. That's changed. When I walk into a bookstore today, when I walk into a school library today, there are many more diverse books. And I would like to think that the Brown Bookshelf played a small part in helping to call for that change. But I do need to recognize that, there were many more before the Brown Bookshelf, before we need diverse books. People like Virginia Hamilton, authors like Virginia Hamilton, I should say, and Julius Lester and Jerry Pinkney, and Dudley Randall, who is the subject of one of my next books, a poet during the Harlem Renaissance who published other poets who were not able to get published in the white mainstream press. So, it was the works of people who came before me, along with, our work at the Brown Bookshelf, and hopefully our little bit of push created some change in the industry.
What impact do you hope this can have in the future?
Well, in all honesty, the Brown Bookshelf is in a period of transition right now. We've been doing this work for many, many years, and thankfully, all of us working authors we're now very busy. We're now producing lots of books, and so we haven't had the time to, support the website like we should, to advocate like we should. So we're really trying to decide, what are we going to do with the Brown Bookshelf? Are we going to chop away some time from our work and continue our work there? Are we going to pass the baton to a new generation of book creators who can then advocate? So I don't know. That story will be told looking forward into the future. But I hope that, that whatever happens with the Brown Bookshelf, that it will continue to be a voice for change. Right now in this country, there's a big problem with the books being banned. Books featuring people of color, people who look like me, are being banned from school libraries. So maybe, possibly, that would be another thing that the Brown Bookshelf would help to push for change there.
Your book, It Just Happened, When Bill Traylor Started to Draw, has received critical acclaim and numerous awards. Can you share the inspiration behind this particular book?
Yes, so It Just Happened was my very first authored book. Before that book, again, I didn't think that I was either smart enough to be able to write a book or capable of being able to write a book. And it was my friend, Diana Aston, who is an author, sent me a newspaper article about Bill Traylor and said, Don, you ought to write this book. And I was like, Diana, you ought to write the book and maybe I'll illustrate it. But Diana said, Don, I really believe in you and I believe that you can write this book. And so I did. I wrote a very awful first draft, but I didn't give up. I revised it and I submitted it to Lee and Low Books' New Voices Award, and it won the award. And the winners of that award get an opportunity to work with the editor to revise the manuscript and get it ready for publication. So that became my very first book. I did not illustrate it. It was illustrated by the wonderful R. Gregory Christie. I often tell students when I visit elementary schools, the most important thing is that not that I illustrate my stories, but that the perfect person for that story tell the story. It's the story of folk artist Bill Traylor, and R. Gregory Christie has a very wonderful folk art style, so he was the perfect illustrator for that book. The book came out in 2012, and I went on to write numerous more books. In fact, I have 3 more books coming out in the next 3 years that I've written and will not illustrate.
In your work, you often highlight historical figures who persevered during the American slavery era. What draws you to these stories?
You know, when I grew up, there weren't many stories in my school library that featured people of color anyway, any kind of story. There were definitely not biographies that featured Black people. And the topic of slavery was usually limited to one little tiny paragraph. Thankfully, I did go to a summer school program every year called the Black Theology Center, where we learned about Black history, or where we learned a little bit more about slavery. But I think that I grew up not really understanding that time period. That's why books are so important. Books on the topic are so important. You know, I was just kind of ignorant about the topic. I was a little bit embarrassed about it. And so I really wanted to stay far away from writing stories about slavery. But then once I started reading some slave narratives and learning more about the topic of slavery, what I discovered is that these are stories of Black brilliance and perseverance in the face of mankind's worst nightmares. And so I realized that these stories are important, that they need to be preserved. I owe it to my ancestors to tell their stories and to pass their stories along. And so I've decided that's kind of where I wanted to stay for a while. I love learning about little known historical figures who have changed the world in the face of adversity. And oftentimes the biggest adversity is the color of their skin or their enslavement in America.
On the topic of color of your skin, have you ever been racially prejudiced against?
I remember at one time visiting an elementary school, because I visit elementary schools all throughout the country. And I remember entering the school, and the kids are always so excited on author day. You know, are you the author? Are you Don Tate? You're the author. And a young little girl walked up to me, and she was white, and she goes, I didn't know that authors could be Black. And for one thing, it kind of surprised me, because typically the author and the librarians are they're preparing them, or they're having them reading my stories, and so they're kind of familiar with who I am on that day. But for whatever reason, this student wasn't. And you know, I wasn't angry with her, and I really wasn't offended, because maybe in her world, maybe she had never come across a book written by an African American author. Maybe she had never come across a book that had been illustrated by an African American. So in her mind, you know, African Americans didn't write books, and that's okay, but that's why my work is so important. So not only that Black kids can see that, yeah, I can grow up to become an author and an illustrator, but, you know, white kids and other kids can grow up to realize that all Black people don't play basketball. You know, all Black kids, you know, aren't rappers. That some of us, or many of us, we are talented writers and illustrators, and we love to tell stories, and we publish many of the books that are in their library.
You've spoken about the importance of not sugarcoating history for children. Can you elaborate on this concept and discuss how you balance honesty with age-appropriate storytelling in your books?
Yeah, so I believe that children are strong, and I believe that children are fully capable of hearing the truth and digesting the truth and understanding the truth. We don't have to to hide history from young readers. We don't have to change history from young readers. We don't have to ban those stories from young readers. I often tell kids, if you are confused, and we live in a very confusing world today, if you're confused about what's going on in the world today, what's going on, you turn on the news and everything is just like driving you crazy. Well, all you have to do is look at what happened yesterday. And if you can understand and know what happened yesterday, it's going to put the world into better context today. So I think that books that feature others who are unlike us are so important to promoting empathy with young readers. I remember when I first got into publishing, there was because we all have bias. We all have distorted biases. And there was a certain topic of a book that I thought I would never be interested in reading. But then I met an author at a conference who had a book out on this particular topic, and I wanted to support the author, and I read that book, and learning about that person's experience totally opened up my mind. It made me a better human being. And I think that is why it is so important that we have so many different types of books in the world, because they open up our minds and they help us to understand each other. You remember, I think it was, I forget the guy who said, can we just get along? Well, I think that can we get along begins with reading a book.
Could you share some insights into your creative process as both an author and illustrator? For example, how do you bring your stories and characters to life?
So I get my ideas in a lot of different ways. Oftentimes the ideas came from other writers. Oftentimes my ideas come through my own life experiences. So for instance, I have a book about a Victorian bodybuilder, and that story was inspired by a time when I participated in natural bodybuilding. So I have a subject, that I want to research, and so I immediately jump on the internet and I start to do some research. And then I go down to the bottom of the page that I'm researching, and I find the sources, and I dig in more to my research. I email or call a librarian. I get on the phone and I reach out to historical societies. Sometimes I got to get on a plane and travel to a place and actually walk the land where the subject actually lived and worked and, walked the ground. And then I write and/or illustrate a very messy draft. I have to give myself permission to write and get through a messy draft. And then I set it aside and I rewrite it or I resketch it. So when I visit elementary schools, I just like to emphasize the fact that writing and illustrating is a process of redoing. It never comes out perfect the first time. That book, when it finally publishes, has been revised and polished and redrawn and over and over, sometimes 70, 80 times before I get it perfect. So the revision process, I believe, never stops. Because after a book publishes and I'm standing in front of an audience of 100 kids and I'm reading that story, sometimes I find myself changing the words. I could have said it like this, or I should have drawn it like that.
What advice would you give to aspiring authors and illustrators, especially those who are passionate about promoting diversity and inclusion in children's literature?
Well, my advice would be, it's kind of boring advice, and I'm sure that many of you have heard this before, but you have to just not give up. You can't be discouraged about some of the crazy stuff that's going on in the world with our stories getting banned. Our stories are important. And while I know that some of my books have been banned from school libraries, what I've decided is that I'm not going to be discouraged about it. I can't change people. I'm not going to change the mind of the parent who doesn't want their children to learn about, a Black historical figure in the library. I'm not going to change that person's mind. But what I can do is continue to write for the children whose parents still care about truth. Because I believe that there are most people in the world, they're still concerned about truth and honesty and diversity and having their kids read about a lot of different kinds of people. So my advice would be to keep telling your story, keep putting your voice out there, and your story matters, and it's going to save lives.
Can you tell us about any upcoming projects or books that you're currently working on or excited to share with your readers?
Yeah, so I have 3 books that are going to come up next year that I'm really excited about. 2 are books that already exist but are coming out in paperback. Roto and Roy Helicopter Heroes is a book that came out a couple of years ago, I believe. And it's the story of a helicopter pilot and a helicopter who saved the day, as well as my story, William Steele and His Freedom Stories, the father of the Underground Railroad, the story of a man who helped hundreds of enslaved people escape slavery on the Underground Railroad. This book published a couple of years ago. However, it comes out next month in paperback. But the book that I'm really excited about is called The Day Madeira Voted. It's written by my hero, Wade Hudson, and who is the founder of a publication house called Just Us Books. Nancy Paulson Books, however, is going to publish The Day Madeira Voted. And it's the story of two little boys who follow their mother to the voting booth to vote for the first time, and they learn all about the voting process, the importance of having a voice, and it has a surprise ending, which I won't give away. The book publishes this July, and I'm just really looking forward to sharing that warm story with my young readers.
Finally, what message or legacy do you hope to leave through your work in children's literature and advocacy for diversity and inclusiveness?
I just hope that my legacy would be that I told the truth, and then I'm putting these, again, when I was a kid in my school library, there weren't books that featured people of color, and especially books about Black people. So I hope that my legacy is that I helped to change that. You know what I'm saying? That, and it does my heart proud when I walk into a school library and there's 9 of Don Tate's books right there in the school library, brown faces, because it wasn't like that when I was a kid. So I hope that is my legacy. So I hope that my books that catch on, that the readers will read them, and that these books will be around for future generations.
Don, we thank you for sharing your journey, your wisdom, and your unwavering commitment to making children's literature more diverse and inclusive. Your dedication to this cause inspires us all to dream, read, and work toward a brighter and more empathetic world. We eagerly wait for your future contributions, knowing that they will continue to touch the hearts and minds of readers everywhere. Until we meet again, thank you for being a true luminary in the world of children's literature.
Thank you, Christopher, for inviting me to be a part of all of this. It is students like you who inspire me and give me hope for the future. So thank you for your important work.
Thank you so much for that compliment. Thank you. You were so great.